When Adrian Cole first saw the house on the ridge, he felt an unexpected pull toward it, as if the structure itself were aware of his gaze. It stood alone on a barren rise above Briar Ridge, a mining town long past its prime. The windows were unnaturally tall, narrowing toward the top like watchful eyes that never blinked. The yard was a tangled sprawl of brittle weeds and collapsed fencing, and the front steps sagged inward as though tired of bearing weight. It was cheap, far cheaper than any property should have been, and Adrian, eager to start a new life after the collapse of his relationship and career, convinced himself that the house's isolation was a gift rather than a warning. He moved in on a gray morning when the clouds hung low enough to brush the chimney. Inside, the air was dense with the smell of wet stone, the kind that seemed to seep from the very bones of the building. The wooden floors creaked beneath every step, carrying sound through the walls as if the place were hollow. Still, Adrian tried to love it. He swept, scrubbed, patched cracks, and told himself that all old homes protested their age. But the house's complaints felt deliberate. The first night brought an unease he would later recognize as the earliest sign. He slept on a thin air mattress in the living room, surrounded by taped boxes. Around 3 in the morning, he woke to a faint rhythm drifting down from the second floor. Slow, dragging steps moved across the ceiling, growing heavier as they approached the top of the stairs. The sound paused, then resumed, each step accompanied by a faint, raspy swell, something that mimicked breathing. Adrian lay rigid, convincing himself that the sound belonged to shifting timber or the settling foundation. Eventually he managed to fall back asleep, though the noise lingered in his thoughts long after sunrise. As days passed, he explored more of the house. In the upstairs hallway, he noticed a square of drywall that had been patched more recently than the rest. When he pressed the panel, it shifted. Behind it, crammed into a dark recess, lay a small waterlogged notebook. The pages were rotted at the edges, the ink smeared into gray blots, but a few sentences were still legible. Most described the house in increasingly frantic terms, its shifting moods, its refusal to remain still, the feeling of being observed in every room. The final entry was the clearest, a single warning scrawled in jagged strokes. Do not sleep in the same room twice. It remembers you. Adrian shut the notebook and left it on a table, dismissing it as the ramblings of a disturbed former resident. Yet the building seemed to grow heavier that evening, as if aware that its secret had been uncovered. The footsteps returned the following night, only this time, they were not overhead. At 3:14 a.m., Adrian awoke to the slow movement of something descending the staircase. The steps crossed the first floor, stopping just outside the living room. The air thickened. Something pressed against the other side of the door, an unseen presence inhaling deeply, as though scenting the interior of the room. Morning offered no comfort. The smell of damp stone only intensified, and cold patches clung to the walls. Adrian decided to sleep in the guest room upstairs, following the notebook's advice only because he felt strangely compelled. But 3 nights later, as he slept under the slanted ceiling, he woke to the sense that he was not alone. His eyes opened to the far corner of the room where a tall, motionless shape towered. It had no features, only a silhouette in the dark, but the proportions were wrong, too long, too narrow, bent at unnatural angles. The longer he stared, the more the figure seemed to stretch, as though adjusting itself to the confines of the room. He could not move. His breath caught in his throat. The creature never advanced, but its stillness carried menace, as if it were waiting for him to speak, or scream, or acknowledge it in some fatal way. Hours later, without memory of falling asleep again, Adrian awoke alone. The only evidence of the encounter were 2 deep impressions in the carpet where feet, if they were feet, had stood all night. Fear pushed him into town in search of answers. Most residents dismissed his questions, but one elderly man stiffened when Adrian mentioned the house. The man explained that it had belonged to Elias Warren, a miner who lost his family under tragic circumstances and spent his remaining years consumed by grief. He worked obsessively, sometimes through the night, hammering at the walls until neighbors complained. Eventually he wandered into the mines and disappeared. Several rescue workers claimed to have heard scraping sounds deep in the tunnels, accompanied by slow, rattling breaths. No body was ever recovered. When the man finished, he looked at Adrian with pity and something like dread. The house did not rest after Adrian's inquiry. It became something watchful, constantly changing. The attic door shuttered at random hours, despite there being no draft. The basement door routinely swung open, revealing a darkness that swallowed even the beam of his flashlight. He began rotating rooms nightly, driven by restless paranoia, though he tried to pretend he was following the notebook's warning only out of superstition. But the entity within the house was learning. Mapping him. Gathering the scent and rhythm of his movements. It grew bold. One night in the study, exhaustion claimed him for a moment. When he opened his eyes, a creature clung to the wall above the window, long limbs bent inward, head twisted as though listening. Where eyes should have been were only soft, pulsing folds of skin. A thin, vertical slit ran from what might have been the creature's chin up to its forehead, expanding faintly with each breath. Adrian fled the house in blind terror. He reached his car barefoot, the grass cutting into his soles, and drove until the road signs no longer mentioned Briar Ridge. He rented an apartment in a distant town and tried to rebuild a sense of normalcy. For 3 nights, sleep returned to him. He almost believed the events were a product of stress. On the 4th night, at precisely 3:14, he woke to footsteps in his hallway. The sound was identical to the one in the old house, slow, dragging, accompanied by a long, deliberate inhalation. The air filled with the unmistakable scent of wet stone and rotted wood. When he sat up, something shifted on the ceiling above him. The same tall, twisted silhouette clung there, limbs spread like an insect preparing to descend. Adrian fled again, this time to a roadside motel illuminated by a single, buzzing street lamp. The air was cold. The shadows stretched unnaturally long beneath the flickering light. The smell of damp stone followed him like a second skin. The house had not been left behind. It had not been an ordinary structure at all. It was a shape that mimicked homes, inhabiting them like shells, learning every person who slept within its walls. When Adrian abandoned the house, the entity abandoned its shell and found him again. And now it was close. He sat in the parking lot, unable to enter the room, unable to close his eyes. The light above him began to flicker, each dimming pulse allowing the darkness to creep a little nearer. The air around him tightened, as though something vast and patient were inhaling just over his shoulder. The house had followed. And it had learned him completely.